Hello and welcome to our study of Engage, How to Know God. I'm Justin, the pastor of spiritual formation here at Eastern Hills Wesleyan Church. And I'm so excited to welcome you to this study of how we're going to look at 6 heart transformations that it takes to know who God is. We're going to look at the gospel and see what that really is all about. It wasn't too long ago that I was sitting in a waiting room with my wife. She had an appointment and we went to this fortress-like hospital. I mean, it was this place where you took this creaky elevator up and there was this drab waiting room and there was nothing else to do. So I was looking around and up on the ceiling was this moth right next to a light. She was in her appointment, I was trying to work on stuff, and so I was daydreaming about this moth, and I watched as it kept hitting the light over and over again. I thought about it and I was like, you know what, I think that's kind of like our lives. What I mean is this. You see, that moth kept hitting that light, I assume, because it was trying to get outside. It was trying to get back to the place it was meant to be with the sunshine and the breeze. And yet it had no idea that what it was doing was not taking it any closer to its dream. In our lives, we get to that same point where we keep hitting ourselves against things in our lives, trying to get more toys or more relationships or all kinds of things to try to satisfy us when we're missing out on the whole point of our existence, to know God. That's what this study is about. We're going to find out through these 6 heart transformations that we can know God for sure and that He can change our lives. Today we're going to start with this first heart transformation called Humbled by God's Eternal Truth. In the upper room that we have in our church, it's a prayer area, we have this one section that's called Humbled. And it's a place where we have all kinds of pictures of sunrises and sunsets because I think that's something that really gets us to a point of feeling that humbled feeling or that sense of awe when I see a sunset or stars. When I was in college, I actually was in Uganda, and one night the power went out, we went outside and we looked up at the stars. It was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. I mean, I felt like you could see the whole galaxy. I was even convinced that we saw the International Space Station. It was an amazing night because I felt so small. And you see, each of us, if we're going to come to know God, we have to start with an understanding that we are so small and insignificant and we know so little. We have to realize that there is a God and then I'm not Him. So we're going to take a look at that more today. Before we dive into that, let's hear a testimony from Pastor Mike Dwyer, one of the pastors at our church.
I have not always been a Christian. Indeed, I think if I put a date on it, I was about 40 years old when I finally surrendered to Christ. And that's only after I got to know Him quite a bit. You see, I was raised in the shadow of New York City and all the suburbs as my father got transferred from place to place. And I lived in a household that was pretty traditional for back then in the 50s and 60s. And at that time, my 6 brothers and sisters, and then finally my 7th brother came along, so 7 brothers and sisters were part of this giant Irish Catholic family that kind of modeled ourselves after the Kennedys. Both my mother and father had gone through Catholic schools, from grammar school all the way through colleges, and each one of them had a strong culture of Irish Catholicism. That doesn't mean that they knew who Christ was or that we had the real concept of faith or relationship in Jesus Christ. Rather, there was this whole thing about who we were and the image of who we were that was so important. Even though we had people in our family who were priests and nuns, we were inundated with the trappings of faith, but we didn't have anything of the knowledge of faith or the feelings of faith. And so, under those circumstances, we had gone to church as a family up until I was about in 6th grade, at which time my parents just stopped going. And so I stopped going. And I never returned to church until much later on in my life. And how that happened is kind of interesting. What my family had taught me my whole life was that I could be self-sufficient and that I would be the master of my own fate. And so that I had to get better and better and be top of my class in high school, which I ended up doing, and top of my class in college, which I ended up doing. And I would compete with my brothers so that if he got a 98 on a Regents exam, I had to get 100. And if I had to do something with school with a project, my project had to be better than my brothers, my sisters. We all competed with one another to be the top. And we knew that we could be self-sufficient. My father had a motto. It was, let people know that you're in the room. You know, he wanted every one of us to do something great. And he pushed me towards the law, and so ultimately I went to law school and graduated at the top of my law class and ended up being an attorney for a long career. As part of my life experience, I found it still, despite all my ability to do things well, and I did things, I think, pretty well back then. I was self-sufficient. I was pretty well financially set. I was pretty well done with the family. I had 4 kids. I married a beautiful lady who was a good woman. I had a good family. We had strong morals, but no church involvement, no Christian involvement, nothing about Christ. And yet, in the midst of this life that I had been living, and I did some things I'm not proud of. I drank too much. There was times when we weren't always as good as we could be to each other, and there was a lot of nastiness in the family sometimes. So those things they creep in on a situation where you're not Christ-centered. And finally, what ended up happening with me was I realized that there had to be more. I heard this little voice in the back of my head and in my heart and spirit. I had always known that there was more of an existence somewhere, that there was a special somebody out there. I had always believed in a God. I wasn't sure what that God looked like, or perhaps if Christ was really God at that time. So what I ended up doing was exploring that. I had always been taught that the way of knowledge and intellectual pursuits would get you where you wanted to go. So I started looking into things. I looked extensively into the religions of the world, took a couple of classes in different comparative religions. I ended up very involved with Eastern philosophies and religions, including Buddhism and Taoism, and found them to be a little bit empty because there was no responsibility put on you in those religions, or at least as far as I felt. Under those circumstances, and they just didn't ring true. Let's put it that way. And I ended up reading all these books, and one writer in particular, a guy named Alan Watts, had written about the ability to put together Christianity with Buddhism. And I liked that, so I was very interested in those kind of books, and I read a lot of those. But I did not find necessarily the full truth in those books. They kept pointing back to Christianity and my earlier faith that I had never really been involved with or explored other than going to church on occasion. And so I ended up in my living room quite frequently reading these books, and my wife, who was on a similar path, her name's Karen, she ended up pointing me to the Bible. And she said, "You read so much, why don't you give the Bible a second chance? Go back and really read it, because I don't think you've ever read it." She was involved in this church at the time. She had been here before I was, and ended up pulling me into a relationship with the Word. And so, in fairness, I said I had to be fair enough to read the Bible again, and I did. And as I read the Bible, for me, light started to come on. And I'm fully convinced in the verse that says, if you seek God with all your heart, He'll seek you. As you draw near to Him, He will draw near to you. And I believe in my case, that's what happened. And so, as I read the Word and I read the Bible, in my arrogance as an attorney, I was sitting there trying to actually disprove God through His Word. And I couldn't do it. I found that it was too consistent. I said to myself, and this was going to sound supremely arrogant, but I said, I couldn't write this book. I could not do it. And so someone greater than a man must have written this book. I continued to look into the Bible and read it second, third, fourth time. I continued to look for chinks in the Bible and couldn't find any. I continued then to find out how the Bible was put together. And I looked into some books that taught me how the Bible was supposed to be read. And all those books ended up teaching me that this Bible had been put together over a great period of time, 1,500 years, and had been done by all kinds of different writers, and yet it was so consistent. That really hit me, that the consistency of the Bible and all the writers must be more than man doing it. And so I thought to myself, well, maybe, just maybe, I should give this Bible a chance. The other thing that was strongly in my mind at that time was I started reading other books. a friend who was a Christian downtown and was trying to teach me about Christianity led me to C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. Wonderful book. Highly recommended to anybody who's searching. The C.S. Lewis book and the chapter that he pointed me to as I was reading that book was called The Great Sin, and it dealt with the sin of pride. And after reading that chapter and rereading that chapter a number of times, I realized that my whole life I was attempting to be the one in charge. And it wasn't really working that well. I mean, although I had good things happening, emotions and feelings and bad stuff still happened, and I hadn't been able to organize all that in my own mind and intellectually figure that all out. And so I ended up trying to get away from myself a little bit, I think. It's funny, you get taught your whole life, especially in my family, to be self-sufficient, to make sure you can be self-sufficient, take care of everything. And I ended up finding out that the way to freedom was to let myself go and to not be self-sufficient, but to be sufficient on God. And that was a hard lesson for me. It was one that was integrally important for me, and I think one that everybody has to find, that you have to let go of who you are, let go of the God that you think you are, and let go of the control of your own life. And as the singer said, we really need to let Jesus take the wheel.
Like Mike testifies to, too often we put ourselves in a place where we are the center of our universe. And until we're willing to be humbled by God's eternal truth, we can't come to a place of even knowing God. We take ourselves way too seriously. Let me throw some statistics at you to help us understand how small we really are. Scientists believe that the observable universe is around 93 billion light years big. And it continues to expand, 93 billion light years. If you were wondering, a light year is 6 trillion miles. I mean, that is massively huge. We can't even conceive of how big this universe is. Scientists estimate that there might be 500 billion other galaxies other than the Milky Way. And if that's true, then there might be as many as 5 times 10 to the 22nd power habitable planets in the universe. For our modern spacecraft to reach the nearest star, it would take 80,000 years, around 80,000 years. And scientists estimate that even when we look at the universe, we can only see about 4% of what really is there. 96% of that is what they call dark energy or dark matter. We are so small. I mean, this universe is so gigantic, and compared to that, we are so infinitesimally small. And I'm not saying that to offend you. I'm just saying that for us to recognize and realize how big the universe is and how small we really are. C.S. Lewis wisely said, "True humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less." It is realizing that the world doesn't center around us. This is part of the process of recognizing and being humbled by God's eternal truth. But I think, and I write in the book, that I think there's 3 things that we have to be humbled by if we are to come to the place of knowing God. First, we have to be willing to say that there is absolute moral truth that isn't based solely on what I think or feel. Second, we have to be willing to say that there is an eternity beyond this world that I have to come to terms with. And third, we have to be willing to say that there is a God who created me and has the answers that I've been looking for. Let's start with that first one of absolute moral truth. Now, for most of human history, it would have been kind of absurd to claim that there is no absolute moral truth, that there is no absolute standard by which we can gauge what is right and what is wrong. But today, when you walk around and you talk to people, and in our kind of moral climate of today, it's totally conceivable that some of us, and maybe some of us have already done this to other people, but to walk around and say to somebody, yeah, you believe totally what you want to believe, I'll believe what I believe, and we'll just kind of leave it at that. You say what you say is true, I say what I say is true, and we're fine. The strange thing about that is that 2 opposing things cannot be true. You know, if we want to find out what's right or wrong, we have to come to the place to understand and be willing to be humbled by the fact that there is absolute moral truth. If we think of it in terms of other things of our life, you know, when I look at math, 2 plus 2 equals 4, whether I like it or not, or whether I feel like it should or not. You know, grass is green whether I want it to be or not. It just is. The letter A makes a particular sound because that's how it's defined. I mean, there's things in this world and there's facts in this world that are just true whether I want them to be or not. And yet when we come to our own moral and spiritual lives, we somehow think we can trust our instincts for what is right morally. That there is no baseline of truth out there that is really the standard by which we need to understand what is right or wrong. And that should scare us a little bit. Especially it should scare us when we understand what those statistics say about the universe, about how small we are and how little we actually know. You know, when I think about it, even the smartest people that you know or I know, maybe some of you out there are really smart, you're a rocket scientist, whatever, you're a super smart person. Probably the smartest people around us pretty much only know about 3%, maybe 4% of what's knowable in this universe. I mean, the average person probably knows about 1 to 2% of what is really knowable in this universe. Why would we stake everything on that? Why would you stake everything on the fact that you know how you should live morally and that nobody else can tell you outside of that how you should live? It's hard for me to trust myself in that. In 1 Corinthians 1:25, the Bible says, "For the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength." We have to be willing to humble ourselves to the point of recognizing that maybe God holds the answers to this life. Maybe there is absolute moral truth out there somewhere, and we have to be willing to recognize that maybe we should listen to Him more than we should come up with our own ideas about what is right and what is wrong. The second thing we have to be humbled by is to recognize that there is an eternity that I have to come to terms with, that we have to come to terms with. I struggled in my life sometimes whether I believed in God or not. I grew up as a pastor's kid, and I was around church, and I was around faith all my life. And yet I came to a point in my life where I really questioned whether God was real. And so I went on a journey. I decided to seek for the truth and to figure out what really is real. And one of the things that really helped me through that process was I was confused, you know, when I look at what society often says about the beginning of the universe and that we don't have a creator, but that it just kind of came out of nowhere. I was confused, and then I came to figure out through some materials I was reading this kind of thought experiment about eternity. Think through it with me. You know, most scholars and scientists would say that there was a big bang. There was a time that the universe started. You know, at one point there was nothing, and at the next moment there was something that was expanding and amazing, and they would claim a day that would have started. But they're saying at that point that there was nothing and then there was something. Now, the confusing part to me is to recognize that many of those same scientists would say that they don't believe in God, and they don't believe in some kind of force that started that. And yet, for most of us, we would recognize the reality that something doesn't come from nothing unless something causes it. Let me say that again. Something doesn't come from nothing unless something causes it to happen. It's just kind of common sense, isn't it? And so when you think about that, if there was nothing at one moment and there was something the next moment, something had to start that. There's only really two solutions to that problem. Either we have to believe that if there is no God, that all this stuff, this material, that, you know, this room, that me, and all this stuff, all the matter that exists was there eternally, that this universe has been around eternally. Because otherwise there had to be something that started the beginning of it. But see, that would contradict what most scientists say. Most scientists would say that there was a starting point and a big bang that kind of came from nothing. So in that mind, the most logical thing to think of at that point is that there is something outside of this universe that started it. And if that's true, that means there has to be some kind of eternal nature to that being outside of this universe. That there is a God that is eternal, and that there is a place beyond this universe that is eternal. I know that's all kind of confusing, but hopefully you're following me. I believe that God has set eternity in our hearts, and that we look beyond this world because we really believe in the end that there is something beyond just this world. Yeah, that you've looked on a sunrise, a sunset, and you've recognized that there is something beyond this. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, God has set eternity in the hearts of men. We have to be willing to be humbled to understand that there is an eternity, and that we have to come to terms with what we believe about it. That we have to make a decision about what the rest of our eternal life is going to look like. Finally, the last thing we have to be humbled by is that there is a God that we can come to for the answers about life. Romans 1:20-25 says this, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images to be made look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and they worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. This passage is Paul the Apostle talking about how even though what we look around and we see around us really testifies to the fact that there is a Creator God that created this universe, that there is a starting point, that there is somebody outside of this universe that we can trust, that although that seems to be relatively evident, that we often in our hearts turn away from that. And we decide instead to worship and serve created things, to worship idols, to live out our lives in kind of the mundane things of the world instead of recognizing that we need to be thankful and bless the name of the God who created all these things. And when we do that, our lives just boil down to meaninglessness in the end. That we can't have answers about what is in our eternal destiny. That we can't have answers ultimately to the deepest questions of meaning that we ask on a daily basis. We have to be willing to come to God for our answers and to let Him be the place by which we define our journey. A lot of times, we just simply don't want to listen to God. We want to do our own thing, but that doesn't fulfill us. And we're going to talk about that more throughout our journey of this book of Engage How to Know God. In the meantime, before we do anything else, we have to be willing to be humbled by God's eternal truth in our search for absolute moral truth, in our search for eternity, in our search for answers. How do we do that? Well, it's pretty simple. 3 really simple steps we can take. If your first step into faith, you're not really somebody that really goes to church or knows much about faith, you can do these steps. Or if you've known God for a long time, you can do these steps as well. And they're this. First, pray. Simply talk to God. Maybe you've never done it before and it almost feels like you're talking to the ceiling. But in faith, just start praying. Just start talking and talking to God about what's really on your heart. Tell Him your doubts, your fears, the things that are in your life. And just say that if He's real, would He truly show Himself evident in your life? Second is start to seek out the Bible. If you're really seeking for truth, then test the Bible. See what it really says. A lot of people that are just starting that journey, starting the Gospel of John, but you can kind of start anywhere and just search for truth. Search what it says about Jesus, about does this have answers to the questions that I've been asking? And finally, start to question yourself. What do you really believe? How does that belief actually shape your life? Start to ask yourself questions about how you're actually living your life. As you go to discussion with your small group, I just encourage you to kind of discuss these things about truth, eternity, and answers, and come to this realization together. What does it look like to be humbled by God's eternal truth? And maybe talk about how you could help each other in that journey. And remember, if you already know God and you're doing this study, you've already come to a point of surrendering God's grace, humility still needs to be part of our everyday longings after God. And so maybe you've been in a place where you kind of let go of that humility for a while. This is a good chance to restart and to focus again on being humbled by God's eternal truth. I pray that your group discussion is beneficial.